Hey, you've heard about it, people talk about it, but just what is the Talmud? This multi-volume book or books written in Hebrew and Aramaic that is the center of the Jewish religion at the heart of who a Jew is, that has transformed the Jewish world. What is it? What's in it? Why is it there? Well, let's go back to Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, God gives Moses the Torah, but he gives it to him in two sections. One section is to be written down, called the written Torah, or as we know them, the 5 books of Moses. The other section is the Torah Shebe'al Peh, which means the oral law, to be written down, actually not to be written down at all, to be transmitted orally, memorized and taught from Moses to Joshua, from Joshua to his disciples, throughout all of time. Now I will add as a footnote that the the oral law, was written down, or started to be written down approximately 18 centuries ago by the great Rabbi Judah the Prince, because he lived at a time of Roman persecution. And he said, if the Romans keep this up, the oral law will be forgotten, because they very often forbid the rabbis from teaching it to their students. So if it gets forgotten, then Jewish life will be irreparably damaged. Time to do something brave and to start writing it down. And so he wrote down the main topics of the oral law in a work called the Mishnah, which subsequent rabbis expanded upon in a section called the Gemara, which is what the Talmud is. The Talmud contains the Mishnah and the Gemara. It is the written down version of the oral law. So that's what the Talmud is technically. But what is this oral law? Why a written law? Why an oral law? What's the point? I like to give the analogy of an advertisement versus an instruction manual. The written law of Moses is the advertisement. It tells us the commandments. It tells us what they are about. Sometimes it gives us insights about how these commandments can elevate us spiritually and connect us deeply to God. But it does not give us any practical instructions about how to observe the commandments. For example, it says if you wish to eat meat, you have to slaughter the animal as you were commanded to do so. But if you look through the entire written law, you won't find a detail about how to slaughter an animal properly for it to be eaten. For this, you need the oral law, where all of those details are filled in great expansiveness. And so therefore, the oral law serves that purpose. Why was the oral law, though not written, makes sense to write it down? Perhaps because it was too voluminous, it would be too big, and perhaps a more sublime reason, and that is to ensure that Jews would be able to observe their commandments in every generation, in every time, in every place. Because the world changes, technology changes, societies change, and therefore you need to have living rabbis who can interpret the law, they interpret the written law and extract from it the practical laws, and you need those rabbis in each generation to teach about that particular time. For example, the Torah says that one is not allowed to light a fire on the Sabbath. But what about an electric light? That didn't exist at the time of Moses, so you need the oral law and the rabbis who are its custodians to delve in and analyze and make a decision. So that's the necessity for the oral law. But there's a very important difference between them, as I mentioned earlier, that I want to go into. And that is perhaps best learned by the most classic misunderstanding in the Bible, perhaps. The Bible says that if a person pokes out someone else's eye, the punishment must be an eye for an eye, a hand for a hand, a tooth for a tooth, and so forth. And in places where they only look at the written law, that's what they do. Tragically, because that is not justice. What is justice? So the oral law comes in and says it doesn't mean poke out the eye, it means pay the person for the damage done to them by the loss of their eye. That is justice. Just to give you an example, let's say, we'll pick 2 dead people. Let's say Luciano Pavarotti and Vladimir Horowitz, the great pianist, had a fight, and Pavarotti chopped off Horowitz's hand. Now, you're going to tell me that it's justice to then cut off Pavarotti's hand? It may seem like it, but that's superficial. It's not justice at all. Because by cutting off Horowitz's hand, Pavarotti has destroyed Horowitz's career as a pianist. But if Pavarotti loses his hand, terrible, painful, sad, but he can still sing the same high notes that he could sing before. So you can't tell me that it's justice to do a hand for a hand literally, but rather Pavarotti must pay to Horowitz the value of his hand, which, well, if it was Horowitz's hand, whoa, that would be expensive, as opposed to had he knocked off the hand of, say, another tenor, Enrico Caruso. Okay? So there you see the necessity for the oral law to show us how the written law is indeed justice. You may ask then, why doesn't the written law just say the money, the value of the hand for the hand? The answer, I believe, is because it's teaching us the spiritual heart of the commandment. If I were to think about harming another person, about chopping off their hand, and I would think, how would I feel if this was done to me? If we have that sense of unity, that I feel the feelings of the other, then I would never even go so far as to consider harming them. So therefore the Torah is teaching us the underlying principle of justice, of fairness, and of putting yourself in the other one's shoes. When it comes to the practical law, for this we need the oral law. Now, what is written in the Talmud? The Talmud contains mostly laws. There is a minor section, a smaller section of stories, historical stories, allegorical stories, and ethical teachings, but the vast majority of the Talmud are laws. It's divided into 6 sections. Some of them include the laws of agriculture, of taking 10% and giving it to the priests and the Levites, and the restrictions upon planting different species in the same field, and so forth and so on, the sabbatical year. Then you have a section dealing with ritual law, prayers, how to observe the holidays, how to keep matzah kosher for Passover, and so forth and so on. Then you have criminal laws about what is considered theft, what kind of witnesses can I rely on in a trial, the laws of courts, how many judges, how do they proceed, how do they come to a judgment. And then you have the laws of marriage and personal status. What about divorce? What about modesty? All kinds of issues relating to that as well. So the Talmud is mostly dealing with practical, technical laws in all spheres and all areas of life. But it also includes these stories that are ethical stories, stories of the sages, enlarging upon the stories of the Bible and adding background material, and sometimes stories that never happened but are there to teach us an ethical purpose. And that is what the Talmud is. So now you know.